You wake up because something is breathing outside. Not your partner, not your dog. Something with teeth. It is 300,000 years ago. There are no locks, no weather app, and whatever stands between you and the leopard is probably made of branches, hide, smoke, or luck. There is also absolutely no customer support department for the leopard currently inspecting your sleeping area. The obvious answer is that humans built homes to stay warm, dry, and uneaten. Sensible. Also incomplete. Because a roof does more than block rain. The moment you build a place, you create an inside and an outside. You protect fire. You give injured people and exhausted parents somewhere safer to sleep. You leave tools where you expect to find them tomorrow. You decide who belongs near the hearth and who does not. And the archaeological trail is much stranger than a neat little caveman invented huts story. It includes preserved grass beds, suspicious circles of stone, brush shelters with organized work areas, and 2 interlocking logs shaped almost 500,000 years ago. So why did humans start building homes? Was it protection, comfort, family, storage, territory, or the first attempt to make one corner of a dangerous planet behave? Probably all of them. Let's go back to the night we stopped merely finding shelter and started making it. The short answer is protection. Rain steals heat. Wind makes fire difficult. Insects treat exposed skin like a public buffet. Predators are less enthusiastic about entering a space full of smoke, noise, and alert humans than they are about approaching one sleeping body on open ground. So yes, early structures helped people survive. But humans already had shelter before they had architecture. Trees cast shade, rock overhangs blocked rain. Caves offered walls, roofs, and occasionally a resident bear who had not approved the sublease. If protection were the only goal, our ancestors could simply have kept borrowing whatever the landscape provided. Instead, at some point, they began carrying branches, cutting wood, piling grass, stretching hides, and repairing the same spaces. That difference matters. A shelter's anywhere the environment protects you. A built shelter is a place you deliberately change. A home is harder to define. It is not automatically a permanent house, private property, or a tiny prehistoric version of the modern family living room. But it is a place organized around repeated human needs: sleeping, keeping fire alive, storing useful things, caring for people, and expecting to return. The short answer, then, is that humans built homes for safety. The longer answer is that safety became more powerful when it could be arranged, maintained, and shared. And that raises the real question. What was so difficult about the human body that simply sleeping under a tree stopped being good enough? Here is the biological problem. Humans become remarkably defenseless when we sleep. Your muscles relax, your awareness drops. Your reaction time becomes irrelevant because you are unconscious, which is generally considered a disadvantage when something nearby is deciding whether you are food. Then there is the ground. Soil and stone pull heat away from the body. Damp surfaces make that worse. Grass, leaves, hides, or a raised platform create insulation between warm skin and cold earth. Even a crude windbreak can protect a fire, and a protected fire means heat, light, cooked food, smoke, and a much less inviting campsite for animals. Shelter also changes who can survive the night. A healthy adult might tolerate exposure. An injured hunter, an older group member, or a parent caring for a small child has fewer options. A stable sleeping area gives the group somewhere to rest, recover, and keep vulnerable bodies close to warmth. And humans were improving sleeping spaces surprisingly early. At Border Cave in southern Africa, researchers identified layers of grass bedding placed over ash, dating back at least 200,000 years. The cave was natural, but the floor was not. People carried in plants, created areas for resting and working, repeatedly renewed the surface, and sometimes burned older bedding. This was not a house. There were no preserved walls, no doorway, and certainly no prehistoric real estate agent describing the ash layer as rustic. But it reveals the mental shift that matters. Our ancestors were no longer accepting the ground exactly as they found it. They were editing it. And once you begin redesigning the floor, protecting the fire, and organizing where bodies sleep, how far are you from building the rest of the room? The neat version of the story goes like this. Early humans lived in caves, then farming happened, and eventually somebody invented the house. It is clean, it is memorable, it is also far too convenient. Caves were useful, but they were not everywhere. Many were damp, badly ventilated, difficult to defend, or already occupied by animals that considered human tenancy a personal insult. More importantly, caves preserve evidence unusually well. Stone tools, bones, ash, and debris can remain concentrated inside them for thousands of years. A shelter made from branches, grass, hide, and cord can vanish so completely that archaeologists are left studying a patch of soil and wondering whether it was once a bedroom. That preservation bias makes the past look more cave-dependent than it probably was. And it has produced some famous mistakes. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, a circle of stones about 75 million years old was once interpreted as the foundation of a small hut. It was an extraordinary claim, architecture built by very early hominins. But later researchers raised serious taphonomic problems. The stones may have been moved or accumulated through processes unrelated to a dwelling, and the supposed living floor was not as tidy as the reconstruction suggested. This is archaeology at its most disciplined. Several suspicious rocks appear. Everyone gets excited. And then somebody has to ruin the prehistoric property listing with sediment analysis. So the question changes. Instead of asking, where is the first house? We have to ask, what traces would building leave after the roof, walls, ropes, and wooden posts were gone? Post holes, repeated hearths, flattened floors, patterns of tools and food remains. The house disappears. The organization survives. Now here is the part nobody expected. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, the river did something archaeology almost never does. It kept the wood. The site sits in a wet landscape where an unusually high water table buried organic material in saturated sediments. Without enough oxygen, the usual agents of decay slowed down. Branches, trunks, and wooden tools survived where they normally would have disappeared so completely that nobody would know they had ever been shaped. Among those remains were 2 large logs lying across each other. The upper log had been deliberately cut to form a broad notch, allowing it to fit transversely over the lower one. The surfaces carried chopping, scraping, and cutting marks consistent with stone tools. This was not a fallen tree that happened to land neatly on another tree. Someone had selected the wood, removed material, shaped the joint, and combined 2 heavy pieces into a single construction. The sediments around it were dated by luminescence to at least 476,000 years ago. That is before Homo sapiens existed. We do not know exactly which hominin made it. We also do not know what the complete structure looked like. It may have been a raised platform above wet ground, part of a walkway, or the foundation of a dwelling. The walls and roof, if there ever were any, are gone. Calling it the world's oldest house would be excellent marketing and careless archaeology, but calling it unimportant would be worse. A handheld wooden tool extends the body. This structure changed the landscape. Its makers understood that 2 separate objects could be cut, so they fitted together and performed a larger function. They were not simply using whatever shape nature supplied. They were planning relationships between parts. Basically, somebody invented a prehistoric flat-pack joint, except there were no instructions, no metal screws, and no tiny tool left over afterward to make everyone nervous. Kalambo Falls does not tell us when humans first built homes. It tells us that nearly 500,000 years ago, ancient hominins already possessed the technical imagination required to build large things from wood. And if one structure survived only because water performed a preservation miracle, how many roofs, platforms, windbreaks, and sleeping shelters vanished without leaving even 2 logs behind? Now we can finally see something that looks less like a vanished experiment and more like daily life. Around 23,000 years ago, on the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, a group of fisher hunter-gatherers built a camp now called Ohalo II. The site contained the remains of 6 oval brush huts, several hearths outside them, and a human grave. Water and sediment later sealed the camp, preserving plant material and floor surfaces with extraordinary detail. Inside Brush Hut 1, the ground was not random. Researchers identified several successive floors. One included grass bedding arranged around a central hearth. Another contained a grinding stone fixed near the northern side of the hut, surrounded by dense concentrations of cereal seeds. Stone flakes and tool-making debris clustered more strongly toward the southern area, close to the entrance. In other words, people were not simply throwing everything into a circular pile and hoping they remembered where the sharp objects were. They were organizing space. One area was associated with preparing plant food. Another was used more heavily for working flint. Between them was an access zone that allowed people to move through the hut. The patterns were not perfectly rigid. Prehistoric people occasionally dropped things in the wrong place, maintaining an ancient tradition, but they were clear enough to show repeated, structured behavior. We should be careful. Ohalo II was not the first village, and those brush huts were not miniature versions of modern family houses. Archaeology cannot tell us what the occupants called them, how they divided relationships, or whether someone complained that the grinding stone was always in the way. But the site shows something crucial. A shelter was no longer just a roof over bodies. Its floor had become a map of daily life, sleeping here, making tools there, preparing food over there. The structure was shaping behavior even while behavior shaped the structure. And that is when shelter begins to look remarkably like home. So what were homes probably for first? Not one thing. Several useful things began reinforcing each other. First, a built shelter reduced exposure. A roof redirected rain. A wall slowed wind. Bedding separated warm bodies from cold, damp ground. A raised surface kept people above mud and some crawling visitors. None of this made life comfortable by modern standards. It simply made the environment slightly less committed to killing you. Second, a home protected the survival system around the body. Fire stayed drier and easier to maintain. Fuel could be stacked nearby. Tools could remain where they would be needed again. Food, hides, fibers, and other materials had a better chance of surviving the night instead of becoming wet, scattered, stolen, or investigated by something with paws. And then there were people. An injured adult could rest near warmth. Older group members could remain protected while contributing knowledge and work. Parents could keep small children inside a more predictable space. Shelter did not invent care, but it made care easier to organize. Third, building reduced uncertainty. If a group expected to return, repairing an old windbreak or hut could cost less than starting from nothing every night. A familiar hearth, known sleeping area, and stored materials turned tomorrow into a slightly more manageable problem. Think of it as humanity's first subscription service. Continuous protection in exchange for endless maintenance. We cannot point to one ancient builder and identify the original motive. Rain, sleep, fire, food, safety, and cooperation probably overlapped from the beginning. A structure became valuable because each function strengthened the others. The real advantage of a home was not that it solved one danger. It gathered many small survival problems under one roof. And once people invested labor in a place that kept holding them back, leaving it behind became a much more complicated decision. The next assumption to break is that homes arrived with farming. They did not. Long before people planted permanent fields, hunter-gatherers were already building huts, repairing familiar camps, and returning to productive places over multiple seasons. Mobility was not the opposite of having a home. A group could move across a wide territory and still know exactly which lakeshore, riverbank, or sheltered basin was worth coming back to. Qarni Hafi in eastern Jordan makes that point unusually clear. Around 20,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built huts at a large aggregation site near what was then a much wetter landscape. Archaeologists found dense occupational deposits, repeated hearths, compacted surfaces, middens, and two hut structures that predated the better-known stone houses of the Natufian period. The site appears to have been revisited repeatedly for roughly 1,000 years. That does not necessarily mean one population lived there permanently. It may have been a seasonal gathering place where different groups returned to hunt, work, exchange materials, perform rituals, and renew social connections. So the choice was not simply nomad or homeowner. Prehistoric humans could carry most of their lives with them while investing heavily in certain places. A lightweight shelter might be built quickly, repaired on a later visit, then replaced when its materials finally failed. No permanent address was required. Just memory, expectation, and enough confidence that the place would matter again. This is where a shelter begins to outlive a single night. People leave, but the hearth remains. The floor remembers their feet. The structure waits to be repaired. And once a group expects to return, a place is no longer just somewhere they happen to stop. A shelter does something strange the moment people begin using it repeatedly. It creates rules without speaking. Inside, the fire belongs here. Bedding goes there. Sharp tools stay near the work area, preferably not beneath anyone's foot. Food preparation happens where light, space, and equipment make it practical. Outside is weather, waste, strangers, predators, and all the other things the wall was built to negotiate with. That layout becomes a kind of social language. At Ohalo II, the distribution of bedding, grinding equipment, seeds, hearths, and stoneworking debris suggests that different activities were concentrated in different parts of the huts. We cannot reconstruct a prehistoric household chart from the dirt, but repeated spatial patterns strongly suggest that people shared expectations about how the space should be used. And expectations require communication. Someone gathers branches. Someone clears the floor. Several people agree where the entrance should face and where smoke can escape. Later Natufian structures, including shelters at Ainan, show even more deliberate planning, with post holes, hearths, benches, and geometric relationships between walls, post holes, and hearths that suggest the builders were working from a deliberate spatial plan. A home was becoming more than protection. It was a physical model of cooperation. It also created belonging. A repaired hearth could connect one visit to the next. Familiar tool areas and sleeping places turned memory into geography. This was our place, not necessarily private property, not necessarily one modern family, but a location shaped by people who expected one another to understand its rules. The wall kept wind out. It also made an entrance, and an entrance immediately raised another question. Who was allowed through it? That is where the home becomes deeply human. It protects bodies, organizes relationships, preserves memory, and draws a boundary around the group. Unfortunately, boundaries have two sides. Here is the uncomfortable part. The same wall that keeps rain, wind, and predators outside can also keep people outside. A shelter creates a boundary. At first, that boundary may simply protect sleeping bodies and a valuable fire. But once people begin storing food, tools, fuel, hides, and other resources inside, controlling the structure also means controlling access to what it contains. That does not mean the first hut invented private property. Human societies have organized sharing, ownership, obligation, and access in many different ways. A doorway is not automatically a mortgage agreement, but architecture gives those relationships a physical form. Someone can decide who enters, who sleeps closest to the hearth, which objects remain inside, and whether stored supplies belong to one person, a household, or the wider group. Building also creates investment. If people spend days cutting wood, collecting grass, digging floors, and repairing walls, abandoning that place becomes costly. The structure is no longer just protection. It is accumulated labor. Much later, in more settled societies, differences in house floor area and storage capacity can help archaeologists investigate differences in material wealth. Larger houses may hold more people, more food, more possessions, or more political influence. But these are proxies, not mind-reading devices. A large building does not always mean a rich family, and wealth does not always appear as floor space. So homes did not inevitably create inequality. They created something more basic, controllable space. That could support care, cooperation, and shared security. It could also support exclusion, inheritance, status, and power. The wall solved a survival problem. Then humans began deciding who benefited from the solution. So what is the honest answer? We do not know when humans built the first home. The earliest structures were probably made from wood, grass, hide, and fiber, the exact materials least likely to survive. Archaeology can preserve a stone blade for 1,000,000 years, while erasing the shelter built with it. Any precise first house date would therefore be more confident than the evidence allows. What we do know is substantial. By roughly 476,000 years ago, ancient hominins at Kalambo Falls were shaping large pieces of wood and fitting them together as part of a constructed feature. By at least 200,000 years ago, people at Border Cave were arranging grass bedding over ash and repeatedly reorganizing their living surface. By around 23,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Ohalo II were building brush huts with floors divided into recognizable areas for sleeping, food preparation, fire, and tool production. Those facts strongly suggest a long process rather than one sudden invention. Humans probably began building shelters to reduce exposure and protect fire, food, tools, and vulnerable bodies. They kept building because an organized space saved labor, supported cooperation, and made future activity more predictable. Eventually, repeated use turned structures into places connected to memory, belonging, and control. We cannot know when a shelter first felt like home to the people inside it, but the essential transition is clear. Humans started building homes when changing a piece of the landscape became more useful than simply accepting whatever shelter nature happened to provide. The first home was not necessarily 4 walls. It was a decision. This place can work better for us. You are still living inside that ancient decision. Look around your home. The roof controls rain. The walls control wind and temperature. The bed lifts you away from the ground. The kitchen organizes food. Doors, locks, hallways, shelves, and rooms quietly tell people where bodies and objects are supposed to go. Most of the rules are so familiar that you no longer notice them. You know which spaces are public and which are private. You know where guests stop. You know which contains the useful tool and which drawer contains 12 objects nobody understands, but everyone is afraid to throw away. That is not entirely different from a brush hut, with bedding near the fire, food processing on one side, and stone tools kept near the entrance. The materials changed. The organizing instinct did not. And somewhere beneath all the decoration, electricity, plumbing, and questionable furniture choices is the same basic promise made by the earliest shelters. Inside, the world is slightly more predictable. The thing breathing outside is now probably traffic, wind, or a neighbor moving furniture at an unreasonable hour. But you can close the door. The fire stays lit. Your tools remain where you left them. The people and objects you care about are gathered within a boundary you recognize. We began by putting pieces of the landscape together. Eventually, we built places that held warmth, work, memory, and belonging. Then, hundreds of thousands of years later, we invented rent.